For me personally, one of the more interesting topics of conversation, it's autonomous vehicles and implications of the technology as far as our day-to-day lives, as far as our workforce, the future workforce, as far as various industries and regulation and what have you. There's obviously a very broad set of topics that this topic will encompass, and we're also probably going to touch on AI in that context as well. To introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to ask Henrik back on stage. Henrik, as you remember, is with Dell Technology, our kind sponsor, so please join me.
Thank you. You guys hear me? Cool. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for letting us be a sponsor. So Rami mentioned I'm part of Dell Technologies. I work for Virtustream, which is the cloud arm of Dell Technologies. And I think two people asked me yesterday, even though I touched on it on the dinner, like, what is Michael Dell, EMC, all these companies? There's 7 different companies. To simplify it, really, Dell Technologies and Michael runs the big company, and there are 7 families of companies. The legacy EMC is what we call Dell EMC, which is the enterprise. I represent Virtustream, which is the enterprise cloud company, and then we have the other companies, the Pivotal, the SecureWorks, the VMware, and so forth. So it may sound a little confusing, but it's a collection of pretty cool technologies, and we're pretty excited where we're going. So thank you very much for letting us be a sponsor. I thought the conversations last night and this morning has been fantastic. Very good setting in a small kind of setting, kind of facilitating an open dialogue. So really looking forward for the rest of the afternoon. I then have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Gerdes. And if you guys don't mind, Chris has such a background and fantastic, impressive background that I'm actually take the time to read his background because I don't want to get it wrong. So Chris Gerdes, leading research in an autonomous vehicle and director of REVS programs at Stanford, Center of Automated Research at Stanford, and Dynamic Design Lab. Chris's laboratory studies at Stanford include how cars move, how humans drive cars, how to design future cars. He formerly served as the CIO at the United States Department of Transportation, DOT, where he worked to foster a culture of innovation across department and to find ways to support transportation innovation taking place both inside and outside the government. He's a current advisor of DOT, and he's a co-founder and truck platooning company, Peloton Technology. Welcome, Chris Gerdes.
So much. So automated vehicles are coming. They're going to dramatically reshape the way that we move. And as a result, they're going to dramatically reshape the way we live, the way we work, how we spend our leisure time. These changes are going to be profound, they're going to be disruptive, and they're going to hit each and every one of your companies. This much is clear. What are those changes going to be exactly? That's a little less clear. But that's what I'd like to work out with you over the course of the next hour. I've been working with automated vehicles for about 25 years now. And I'd like to bring you sort of with us into the lab and onto the track to learn a little bit about some of the technologies we've been developing and what we've seen from that perspective. And then I want to broaden the discussion out a bit to talk about what these sorts of technologies can mean for your business and to give you 3 framing questions that I think will be helpful in thinking through about the impact and the opportunities available with this new technology for each and every one of you. So let me start off with a little bit of the work that we've done. I've had the opportunity to work with an awful lot of really interesting vehicles. So we've been looking at these sort of technologies literally where the rubber meets the road. We've built cars with students in my lab at Stanford. We have instrumented things starting with a Chevrolet Corvette, most recently a DeLorean that I'll talk about a little bit more. We've instrumented vintage race cars, built self-driving race cars. And then I've worked with one of my former PhD students to found Peloton Technologies, a truck platooning company, and try to take some of these developments and actually turn them into a commercially viable business. The motivation behind all of this work has really been one of safety on my part. And when you hear about automated vehicles and hear about safety, there are 2 numbers that always seem to start off the presentation. So I won't deviate from that, and I'll start with those 2 numbers. The first of these is 35,092. This is the number of lives lost on U.S. roadways due to collisions, traffic accidents in 2015 alone. Not only is that a large number, that is an increasing number. 2015, after many years of declines, was up over 2014, and the preliminary data suggests 2016 will be higher still. Too many lives lost, and as an engineer, that's a huge motivation for this technology, to think about the number of lives we can save, the number of families who don't have to go through the trauma of losing somebody in a motor vehicle accident. The other number that gives hope to this prospect of automation is 94%. Now, this is often quoted as a percent of accidents that are due to human error. And I feel like that kind of conjures up the image that humans are asleep at the wheel, and as soon as we put robots in there, everything will be golden. It's not quite that simple. And so I want to dive into this number a little bit. Where it comes from is the National Motor Vehicle Crash Causation Survey. And the specific meaning behind this 94% is that 94% of crashes are due to human recognition, decision, or performance error. So the three different types of things humans have to do to control the car: perceive and recognize the environment, make the right decision, and then be able to control the vehicle in accordance with that decision. Driving is a complicated task, and yet humans are actually rather good at it. There's only one fatal accident for every 100 million vehicle miles traveled on the road. So while automation presents an opportunity to reduce this number, it will only be an opportunity if we can do recognition, decision, and performance as well or better than human drivers. And that is not a trivial challenge. So you often hear this 94% as a way of, let's just get humans out and we eliminate human error. But I think, as all of you know, automation doesn't eliminate human error, it just shifts it. Right? We've taken the human error out of driving, and now we have human error in the programming and design of the systems to consider. Now, this is a good shift. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, you would like to be able to solve these problems in the quiet of a cubicle with many simulations, with the luxury of time to consider different alternatives, as opposed to having to solve it in the heat of the moment as you're getting this information on the road. So this is a good shift, but it's not a trivial one. And so this is one of the things that has been motivating our lab to think about how do we develop machines that can handle these different tasks. Performance is the one I want to start with. And this has motivated a question in our mind. What if we could design a car such that we could use all of its capabilities to automatically avoid a collision? In other words, regardless of what the friction between the tire and the road is, we can use it up to its fullest extent. Could be a dry road, could be raining, could be snowy. We would love to be able to drive right up to the limits of the laws of physics, avoid any accident that it's physically possible to avoid. So where do we go for inspiration for that? We've actually gone out to the racetrack. This may not make sense, right? If you're thinking racing initially, racing, safety, maybe these seem like slightly different topics. But as they say in racing, if you want to finish first you have to finish. So safety is an aspect. What we find is that the world's best drivers take the car up to its very physical limits repeatedly, lap after lap after lap. And we thought, well, this would be a great place to go for inspiration to figure out how we could get machines to do the same thing. Luckily, we had a sponsor with an amazing collection of vintage race cars. Not only that, but also the willingness to allow graduate students to stick funny antennas and sensors on the cars. So we went with these cars and we installed in them sensing equipment that might look more at home in a modern Formula One vehicle than something that you'd normally find in vintage race cars. We put in all of this equipment to measure the suspension movement, to measure basically the acceleration of the vehicle. We wanted to measure the driver inputs. Our donor, while generous, was not too happy about us drilling holes in his car collection. So we had to find ways to put these sensors on temporarily, duct tape things in place so that we're able to easily remove them. We set up a differential GPS base station so we could get the position of the car out on the track to about 1 to 2 centimeters and know exactly where the drivers were out on the road. Cameras to measure their motion. And once we got all of this stuff working, sent the car out on the track in some of these vintage auto races to record what it did. This is a 1963 Corvette Grand Sport, which was another one of the vehicles that we had the chance to instrument. When the cars come back, we were able to talk to the drivers and get their feedback on exactly what they were experiencing. Sometimes they could break down exactly what was going through their head at that moment. Other times we're watching the video mystified by what they're doing with their hands. And so we ask them, hey, we've been trying to figure out what you're doing here. And John Morton in one case said, I've been doing the same thing. I have no idea what I'm doing there. A lot of this really is instinctive, it's reactive, and the drivers are there in the moment. So this is John Morton. He's a racing legend, IMSA champion, Le Mans class champion, and one of the folks that we have the great opportunity to work with out on the track. All right, so what did we learn? Well, you can actually break down racing into some fairly simple processes. And in fact, a lot of books about racing cover the same sorts of discussion about how you handle a turn. And so this is turn 11 at Laguna Seca, not far away in Monterey. It's the tightest turn on the track. And as you see, the approach is to kind of stay on the outside of the turn, go to the inside, and then go to the outside at the end. And what this does is it sort of puts the largest radius in the track and prevents you from having to slow down too much, because you don't want to give up speed when you're in a race car. The other part of this is really the limits of the car's capability, which we can sort of abstract away as a circle. I have a certain amount of friction between the tire and the road. If I have a dry road and race tires, I have a big circle. If I have icy roads, I have a very small circle. But in general, I have some sort of a circle like this that talks about my capabilities. And I can use that friction to brake. I can use it to accelerate. I can use it to corner. But I can't do maximum in all these directions at once. I have some trade-offs that I have to adhere to. And if I fail to adhere to these trade-offs, my car will fail to adhere to the road. And I will have problems with either the front axle or the rear axle losing grip. And so the idea as a race car driver is to come in, you brake, and then you ease off of the brakes as you start to go into the corner until you're at peak cornering. Then you steer out of the turn as you move to acceleration. And so this is the process that it takes to go through a corner. Does that kind of make sense for everybody? I see some nodding. I'd like to make sure everybody's got this. So I'd like you to ask you to stand for just a moment here. Let's make sure that kinesthetically we have this. This is something I do with all of my classes at Stanford as we're discovering this. All right, so imagine you're in your car. You're in your car and you're on the straightaway. What do you want to do on the straightaway? Accelerate. Go, accelerate. All right, so accelerate. Put your foot down on the accelerator, what happens? You go back, right? All right, put your foot on the accelerator and lean. You guys need more horsepower. Right? What kind of car does the parking lot look more impressive than that, right? Okay, you put your foot down on the accelerator, you lean back. Now, what happens when you see the corner approaching? You want to wait until the last second, and then what do you want to do? Brake, go forward, right? And then as you ease off of the brakes, you're going to go into the turn. So you corner, you can go either way. I grew up in North Carolina, so I only turn left. All right, so, and then as you steer out, you're going to accelerate, 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 and then get to the next corner, brake again, okay? We're going to ease off of the brakes, into the corner, into the corner, into the corner. We're going to steer out of the turn as we accelerate, 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 brake into the next corner. Excellent. If you do that like a few hundred times, you can run the Indy 500, right? Okay, thank you. So this is basically what we're learning. We're seeing these processes of laying out the path around the track and then driving it up to the limits of the car's capabilities. So these are really the two parts of the problem. The path that we want to take and driving up to the limits of the car's capabilities. So at this point, we were feeling pretty smart. And we're like, okay, we've got this nailed. We will find the very best path around the track because we will throw as much math at this problem as we need. As much computing capability, we can solve this problem offline. We will just hammer away until we find the single best path around the track, and then we'll drive pretty close to the limits of the car's capability. And so this is what we learned from drivers and what we set out to implement in Shelly. Shelly is a mostly stock Audi TT, and in fact, we made some modifications to give her very good GPS information so she knows where she is out on the track. She has a front laser scanner that she can use to scan for obstacles. We have control over brake, throttle, and steering. And so we decided to take this approach and try it on Shelly at Thunder Hill Raceway Park, which is a track about 2.5 hours north of campus. And this is what she looks like going through the turn. You can see she's going to the outside, brakes, comes down, just nips the inside, and accelerates out. So classically, just like we designed. You can see here in the more complicated series of turns, she's able to turn to the left, go up a hill as she's turning to the right, slam on the brakes, turn to the left, and then turn to the right again. That's a very fun one to watch from the top of the hill. So this is what it looks like if you're standing on the hill as she's approaching. You think, well, that driver's got a pretty decent line up until the time that you realize there's no one in the car. Now that may seem a little bit creepy, but rest assured that inside the car, everything seems really pretty chill. Shelly really doesn't have to make any dramatic changes unless there's a need to save the car from a spin or something, at which point she can react really quickly. So we were pretty happy about this. We had managed to take some information, put it into the car, and develop something that was starting to look like a race car driver. But how good was Shelley? We decided we would challenge her with a bit of a race. This is David Vodden. David Vodden is a CEO at Thunder Hill Raceway Park and a champion amateur race car driver. So he's won Spec Miata championships. And we thought we would see how well he does relative to Shelley. So we had him out on the track at different times. We let Shelley go out on the track, and then we put David in Shelley out on the track to try to compare the times. Now, they were out at separate times, but it's much more fun to watch this as a head-to-head animation. So I'm going to show you the differences. Shelley is in cardinal for Stanford, and David is in blue. And so as they go around the track, they go to this turn 2, which is a large constant radius turn. You see they take different strategies. Shelley's minimizing distance. David's keeping up maximum speed. They're about the same. You can see as David approaches the hill, he's managed to get about a half a second lead on Shelley. He gets a very good jump off of the bottom of the hill. Shelley's still minimizing distance, but she does manage to catch up around these later turns. Now you start to see a few differences. So Shelley has an advantage in this particular animation because she's not carrying the weight of a human. But you also see David is weaving a bit. Shelley is able to find mathematically the straightest line and be able to pull right back even. And so the two of them coming around the track are actually kind of neck and neck right up until the time when David cheats. And so you see we've told the car to stay within the lines. The human, in fact, sees opportunity and gets about a half-second advantage on the car by not obeying the track. Shelley, however, does the last turn extraordinarily well, manages to make that time back up, and then her weight advantage comes ahead on the final straight. And she finishes up this lap just a little bit ahead of our human driver. So it was a first step for us to say, okay, wait a minute, we're pretty close. We've gotten this to the level very close to an expert amateur driver. Is there any difference with a professional driver? So we worked with J.R. Hildebrandt, who's just wrapped up a season as an IndyCar driver, and he took Shelley around. So this is some comparisons with in blue is David, in green is JR, and in the orange is Shelley. And you can see these are segment times at different parts around the track. You can see, for instance, that the humans have a larger scatter, much larger in the case of our amateur driver, much tighter in the case of our professional driver. Shelley is, in fact, much, much more consistent, but on every single segment, slightly slower than our professional driver. The question was why? And this is the picture that really made it clear to us. This is how much variability each of the drivers has as they're going around the track. Shelley, as you see, has practically no variability. Very little difference in the path from one track to the other. That's what we programmed her to do, right? Follow the absolute best path. But the human drivers don't do this. They feel the subtle changes in the car, the tires warming up, the capabilities changing just a little bit on every lap and every turn. And they take a strategy which allows them to make use of that. They're constantly bending the path a little bit in response to the reality of the current situation. Whereas we chose up front the path to follow. When we showed this data to JR said, if Shelley was a human driver and one of the people I was coaching, I would tell her she has her priorities exactly backwards. So we went into this thinking that the problem was find the very best path around the track and then drive close to the physical limits. When in reality, what the best drivers were doing were to find the physical limits of the car and take the path that enables. So this is a strategy which, if you think about it, is actually important, not just if you're trying to be fast around a racetrack, but if you're trying to avoid collisions. Because you don't so much care if I avoid the collision by following this exact path. I want to get out of harm's way as fast as I possibly can. And so we've been adapting this strategy to our algorithms to learn more about how we do that and to see if we can get a car that really will be able to achieve levels of performance better than even the very best human drivers. This quest for performance at the limits has led us in some other interesting directions as well. This is Marty, and as you may see, Marty is actually a 1981 DeLorean. Marty is one of our latest test vehicles. I don't know if anybody has experience with DeLoreans. DeLoreans are really fantastic cars unless you want to accelerate or brake or turn. They actually don't do any of those things well. However, as you can see in this video, they are very easily disassemblable. In fact, all that beautiful steel is not really structural, but just for looks. It's a fiberglass body that lifts up, and then you can make a number of modifications to the vehicle, like taking out the engine and the transmission, making a few minor modifications to the frame, and then in our case, working with Renovo Motors, a local startup, to install a fully electric drivetrain with a fairly ridiculous amount of torque into the car. Once we did this, we had a test vehicle that we could really use for some interesting tests at the very limits of the car's capability. Here we are giving Adam Savage, formerly of Mythbusters, a little bit of a ride in the car. And so we have a set of cones laid out, and you see Marty goes into this nice graceful turn around one of the cones and pulls that out into a full-on drift. So Marty is able to stay at the very limits of handling capability, first of all around a cone, and then sliding around through a gate before coming into sort of an orbit around another cone. Here you can see Marty swinging through the gate and gently settling in around the next cone. This is maybe not as calm on the inside as some of the other tests. And you can see Marty very slowly and deliberately turning the tires into white smoke. We're very grateful to Bridgestone for stepping up as our sponsor here. Yes, those are tire chunks you see flying. And so this is a case where we're trying to drive at the limits, even as the limits are changing. You know, the tires on which we drove the last lap are now this lap's white smoke and flying chunks. So the car has to be able to handle all this uncertainty while driving at the very limits of its capabilities. Again, this is a fairly dramatic illustration, but it's the sort of thing that would also be true on ice. Being able to navigate at the limits of friction safely, plotting a safe path, even when we're using the full capabilities of the car. So I started this off with the question of what if we could use all of the car's capabilities to automatically avoid a collision. And hopefully I've shown you that that part of it seems like we're pretty close, that we're able to get out there and we're able to understand these changing conditions and get the car pretty close to that capability. The end of this is in sight, but as we said, that's only one of the aspects of human error that we'd like to replace, the performance error. There's also the recognition and decision error, which is extremely important when we think about the sorts of scenarios that we may encounter driving the car. Let me give an example. Here's one where I've got the vehicle going down the street. I have a ball roll into the street followed by a child. This is a case where I've got a very large van, so that child was invisible to me before they ran out in the road. How do I design systems which are safe in these sorts of circumstances? Now, a lot of the popular writing about this has been, you know, in terms of trolley car problems, do I hit the child or do I hit the van? These are not really the problems engineers are trying to solve. The problem engineers are trying to solve is how quickly should I be going down this street such that I can reasonably avoid most of these accidents and yet still keep mobility going. Because if I want to avoid absolutely every accident in absolutely every circumstance, I probably won't leave the driveway, right? There's trade-offs that we're making as humans when we want mobility. We go faster. We accept some level of risk associated with that speed. But now we need to quantify that. Now we need to program that. And this is not only a matter of engineering, it's a question of ethics. It's a question of legality. We start to have competing aspects when we're making these decisions. We want to stay safe. We want to be legal. In the case of pedestrians, our legal requirement as a driver is that we should exercise due care. As engineers, we need to think about, what does that mean? How do we actually program that? We also have the desire for mobility. So there are trade-offs. As we go faster, we're going to have more risk of collision, but we're going to get people where they need to be. We're going to have traffic flowing more smoothly. How do we balance these sorts of things? This is not just an engineering decision, it's a societal decision. Sometimes these things are in direct conflict with each other. As an example, here's a case you may encounter often. I've got a van parked where it has absolutely no business being parked and a double yellow line. What does the law say in this situation? The law says, can we cross that double yellow line? No. Does the law actually make exceptions for there being a double parked van? It actually doesn't. The California Vehicle Code doesn't say we could do this. If we went around this van, probably I think most of us would judge that the situation is safe, and if we were convinced that the situation was safe, we'd go around the van and continue, right? Can we program a vehicle to do that? Interestingly, our vehicle code, our legal system, is all set up on some level of human discretion. Right? We would expect that the law enforcement officials here use their discretion and say, well, that was ridiculous. You probably shouldn't have sat there and waited potentially overnight for somebody to come back to their van. This was a reasonable thing to do. But how do we actually program that into a vehicle? Things like speed limits as well. You would think that this is actually a very easy thing to program into a vehicle, right? If speed is greater than 25 miles an hour, slow down, right? And we can do that. We can have the vehicle adhere to a speed limit. But what is that going to mean for traffic flow? Is that the safe thing to do if I'm merging onto a highway? What if I have to avoid an accident? Is it acceptable to speed in those cases? Does my desire for safety outweigh my desire for legality? How do we balance these things? So this is something that we've been working on actually by bringing philosophers and lawyers into our group to work with the engineers and to try to come up with some potential solutions for this as well. All of this is complicated by the fact that you can look at these pictures, and I can put this picture up there, and there's actually no ambiguity in my mind that you all see the same thing that I do. But when you're dealing with actually machine perception, the picture is a little bit different. So this is a Ford vehicle at an auto show with 4 laser scanners on top, 4 LiDAR systems. And this is the way that it sees the world. And you can kind of see that, all right, I can get the outlines of people, but some of those people are occluded. Some of them I can't necessarily see what's going on behind. I certainly am not getting the level of detail from this image that you would get in your brain if I gave you a photograph of this. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind because right now machine perception is still evolving. So that recognition of the problem is not the same as what's going on in your brain. You have the ability to bring context to it. This is still evolving as a technology for machines. Okay, so where does that leave us? A lot of things are advancing. There's some challenges that remain in terms of recognition and making the right decisions in a way that will be societally acceptable. But you see all sorts of automation moving through all sorts of modes of transportation. I mentioned the trucks from Peloton, which are platooning with each other to save fuel and improve safety. You have fully automated vehicles like those from Uber and Google, right now driving on the roads with a human supervising. You have concepts such as the Dubai air taxi, a lot of lightweight aircraft concepts coming through now where the idea would be you don't have to be a pilot, that this would be able to automatically pilot itself from point A to point B, skipping all of the traffic issues with being on the ground. And then smaller drones as well, sidewalk drones such as those from Starship or even Domino's pizza delivery drones bringing your pizza through the air. All of these sorts of technologies that promise automation and promise new ways to move people and things. So in light of this, how do you make sense of all of this? How do you begin to see these emerging technologies and map them into your world to see, again, where are the challenges and where are the opportunities? And I'd like to suggest 3 questions that help to do that based on one particular economic observation. And that economic observation is the cost of mobility, and in particular, the cost of personal mobility. So I want to look ahead into the future. Let's assume that, in fact, we've continued to develop this. Our sensor costs have dropped as they have with all sorts of technologies. If you think about what a camera costs now in your phone and what it cost before, dramatic difference. So in the future, I would argue that we could get vehicles out on the road with something around a $50,000 cost as a vehicle with sensors. It might look something like this vehicle here. Just to be clear, they're not going to sell you this for $50,000 today. It's still a low volume production. But if we think about sensor costs going down, let's just say, for instance, that we had a vehicle that cost $50,000 and we would get about 150,000 miles out of that before it was completely useless, just to put some basic numbers behind it. Let's assume it was electric. We did about 3 miles per kilowatt hour and it cost about 30 cents per kilowatt hour. I drive a Chevy Bolt and do much better than this. Around town, I'm probably closer to 5 miles per kilowatt hour, and I could charge at night for about 9 cents. All right, but let's throw these numbers in here, and that would give us about 40 cents per mile per vehicle. If I start to think about this as a shared mobility concept, where maybe I'm on average with about 3 people occupying my vehicle because it's designed to be sort of like a small bus, or maybe I have individual pods that can fit individual people, then I'm talking about around 13 cents a mile for transportation. Whereas the going rate today is about $1 to $2 per mile. That's an order of magnitude difference. That's huge. And the reason that I'm focusing on the personal mobility aspect, or things like drones that could do deliveries, is because of the large fraction of the cost that's associated with human labor. If you think about moving a heavy truck down the road, yes, we could get some savings if they were driven in an automated fashion, but the cost of the human is not much relative to the cost of that whole operation. If you're taking an Uber or a Lyft, the cost of the human is a large part of that. And so if we think about individual mobility, if we think about moving things in urban environments, and we do that in an automated fashion, the cost could be dramatically lower. Okay, now I haven't included, and I know for this audience it's important, other costs associated with this, like the IT infrastructure necessary to provide these services, and there's a reason for that. We'll pull that out later. But if you think about it, what we could really do with automation is get the cost of providing transportation really down to the cost of the hardware, down to the cost of the per mile energy use. And then if we had a broad enough base over which we could spread the development costs of the automation software, once you had an autonomy engine of sorts that could provide this, you could duplicate it at pretty much zero incremental cost. And once we get down to this cost level, from a societal standpoint, there's really no reason people should be without transportation, at least in urban environments. We shouldn't have transit deserts where people don't have rides. We shouldn't have places where people don't have food. We can simply provide that. So this is the thing that I want you to think about, is what does this mean, right? If suddenly personal mobility changes in cost by an order of magnitude, and again, we're not going to be there tomorrow, but if we think over the long term, this is where we have the potential to go. What is that going to mean? Might it change where I want to live? Might it change the way that I want to shop, or the way leisure activities I have? Maybe, in fact, I invert my whole sense of going places. This is a concept by IDEO and their automobility team about the idea of sending an office to people. And if you sort of start to think about that, if mobility costs get low, why would I not send spaces to people as opposed to always bringing people to spaces? What sort of spaces could I send? Well, I could send office spaces. I could send, you could send the grocery store in a small way. Let people do their own shopping. You could perhaps send them a gym. So you wouldn't have to have a home gym. It shows up in your driveway. You could have a new business model. Instead of selling gym memberships in January, hoping nobody uses it, by March, you can now sell the opportunity to have an automated vehicle with a gym show up in your driveway, hoping that nobody orders it come March. Right? So these are things you can think about. What can we put into these spaces? Classrooms, other things. Do we always have to pull people into spaces, or do we send the spaces to the people? As mobility costs get low, new options start to open up. And then you start to ask yourself, well, if we're moving cheaply and we can do things in different ways, what is that going to actually impact for me? And so this is the first question, is to think really of this mega trend. If I'm getting low-cost, ubiquitous mobility on demand, what will it mean? What will it mean for your businesses? What becomes necessary or scarce? If you think about it, curb space in urban environments starts to become really, really precious. Road space may become precious. How do we price that if suddenly there's the ability to use the roads at a much lower cost than we have today? If we have sidewalk drones competing with bicycles and pedestrians on the sidewalk, how do we handle that? How do we price that? If you think about charging infrastructure, the concepts that you see are often electrified. Where do we have charging infrastructure now? At home and at work. If this model becomes true, those are probably the last places we want it, because those are not the places that cars are lingering. So is our charging infrastructure going into the right place? What about aerial rights of way? If we think about all these drones flying around, the FAA controls the nation's airspace. However, localities set laws for noise and privacy. And these things begin to come into conflict. They've been looking, for instance, at railroads and other places that might provide rights of way for large-scale drone use that people wouldn't complain about. So if we think about that, how are we going to move all of these goods? How are we going to think about new rights of way in the future? All of these things that really were not valuable a few years ago are suddenly extremely valuable, potentially. What may have less value? Well, ownership is a concept, for instance. If I can get anywhere and just call up a car, maybe my desire to own one decreases. If I can get other goods or other rooms brought to my house to sort of exchange in my driveway, that I have the space I need when I need it, maybe I become less desirous of a large house. Parking spaces, again, if I'm not bringing these modules in there, maybe I don't need as many of them. Maybe I actually start to want to live further away, where I can live out in the country. Maybe I have less of a need to live in cities if, in fact, everything that I need could come to me at low cost. Maybe. And I think this is where it's important to be careful. It's because you can sort of do these mind exercises and you can kind of come up with a lot of different discussions about what the future may be. But there have been some trends that have been interestingly stubborn over millennia, in fact, such as the amount of commuting time that people are generally willing to spend. And it's been interesting that across time, this is actually only a fairly recent glimpse from a paper, you see that 60 to 70 minutes is about the sweet spot per day of people's commuting time. Some people spend more, some people spend less, but that's been roughly about the level of time that people have been interested in. And if you go back to city boundaries in ancient times, it's often sort of based around how far you could get around 30 minutes in terms of the density. You see a lot of trends towards 20-minute neighborhoods, places where you can get all of your immediate needs in a 20-minute walk. So will we actually want to live further out? Even if we can enable better use of commuting time, will people be willing to do this? History suggests maybe not. Watching my kids, for whom watching videos on YouTube of other people playing video games appears to be a prime form of entertainment. I don't know if anybody else has seen this. This is a sort of bizarre level of passivity on my part. But then again, I sit there and I watch game shows on TV, and they're like, well, all right. Maybe watching other people play games has been a pastime of ours for many, many decades. Are they going to be any less willing to sit in the back of a car watching these than they are to sit on their couch and watch these videos? So what we do for leisure may shape our willingness, how much time we're willing to spend in transit. Okay, so how do you figure these things out? Starting from the idea that a lot of things are going to change, but the sensitivities may not be known. This is a quote I like a lot from William Gibson, that the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So the question is, are there places out there now that I could go to start to get some insight into these situations that I don't know, these sensitivities I'm not sure about, which way people are going to behave? And the way to think about this is to kind of go take a look at some of the early adopters, some of the early pilots that are coming out. There's some of these in Europe, there's a number going on in the US, and think about where these are being deployed. The big way to think about this is that automating vehicles that can go from any point A to any point B is hard. And as many of you are involved in investments, you know that you probably don't make the most money starting by the hardest problem. So the question is, how do you make this easier? Well, you do things like you reduce the speed, you reduce the operating area, you use some better infrastructure to separate the vehicles, and start to get to places where you can make early deployments and start to learn from that process. And that's why you see a lot of these low-speed urban shuttles, campus shuttles, as some of the first deployments that people are looking at. That's why you see places like Mountain View, California, Arizona, Texas, as places that manufacturers are testing, because they have about the right level of density, enough densities to sustain it without necessarily having to get bogged in urban traffic jams. So thinking about where people are deploying. So if you think about this sort of strategy of mobility as a service, it doesn't have to roll out nationally at once. It can roll out locality by locality. And so getting involved with some of these pilot programs, thinking about how you can bring your expertise into it, can be a very good way of learning what the sensitivities are, getting some very early data about where these uncertain trends are going that could have a big impact on your industry. Okay, now you're here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you've got a guy on stage saying, automated vehicles are exciting, come one, come all, get involved. It may sound like another California offer from the past, the gold rush, right? Come into this crazy time, get involved. There's something in it for you. As Peter Lynch and others have observed, though, a lot of the fortunes that were made in the gold rush were not made by people actually finding gold. They were made by the people selling the picks and the shovels to the people who were mining for gold. And that's the third question I'd like you to consider, is what are the picks and shovels? And how do those picks and shovels relate to your businesses? These are the sorts of things that you might be able to find out as you think about pilot deployments and the role that you might be able to play in some of this. Now, there's certainly some that are fairly obvious. If you think about it, there's been a lot of attention paid to sensors, LiDAR systems like these developed by Quanergy. This is an area where you see a lot of development. New radar sensors, new laser scanners, new ways of processing cameras. Obviously a very important basis, foundational technology. Silicon being another one. This is a board that NVIDIA just announced yesterday. Obviously, NVIDIA and Intel and others have devoted a lot of resources to trying to provide the computing power that's necessary for automated vehicles. 3M has looked at what you can do with smart road signs and better lane markings in order to get better recognition by these vehicles. So these are maybe some of the more obvious picks and shovels that are needed. But if you start to think about it, and this came up in the last session as well, the huge amount of data that these vehicles are generating, what do we do with that? How do you actually pipe that in? What of that do you need? How do you learn from that? How do you actually decide the valuable data from that is hugely important. Some of the companies, obviously, in the automated vehicle space specialize in that, and it's in their wheelhouse, but others don't. And there are opportunities there to partner and think about how those sorts of levels of expertise could come in. But as you start to think about deployments, you may get some less obvious things as well. One of the rules of thumb in developing cars for the highway is that for every one line of control code you have doing something like controlling your throttle or your engine, you have about 10 lines of diagnostic code to try to figure out what you do when something goes wrong. Now, if you think about that, up to this point, there's been a lot of development of those first one lines of code for automated vehicles. The resulting 10 that you need to be able to diagnose, to do predictive maintenance and things like that, are still earlier in their development phase. So if I'm going to deploy these vehicles, how do I make sure that they're constantly monitoring themselves, doing predictive maintenance, understanding where the failures are likely to be, and having that process automated as well? That becomes a very big data challenge. You know, and if you think about it, how do I diagnose some of these failures? The first failure in a car may be something smells funny. How do I actually get that automated? A human can catch that. Can I get a machine to do that? Speaking of smells, as you do deployments, you get to more mundane things like, how do I clean the cars? Right? How do I provide, if this is shared mobility, a sense for people in an automated fashion that they're getting into a clean vehicle for which I could charge a greater price? Some of these things that may seem fairly mundane, how do I do this, are nevertheless huge opportunities as we begin to go forward and think about what are the picks and shovels. It may not all be the flashy technology. There's ways to kind of think about this from pretty much every business structure and everything that would be impacted. So I want to actually end with one that's relevant, I think, to everybody in this room, which is really the question of data. And so a lot of these approaches that are being taken for vehicles are leveraging heavily machine learning. And machine learning is obviously a very powerful technology, but it's also one that raises some important questions about what is it that you're trying to learn. And I purposely gave the example at the beginning of our approaching the problem of racing initially from the wrong framing. And so if we had gone out to the racetrack and said, the question that we want to learn is how do we learn the very best path, we wouldn't actually be solving the question that we want to know, which is how do we drive the car the best that we can. And so a lot of times formulating the problem that you want to learn is very critical. And thinking about how you bring in both the domain expertise to formulate the right problem and the data expertise to actually match that and be able to apply some of these machine learning techniques is critical. So also thinking about what data do we need. You know, if you think about it, every scene, every time that one of these laser scanners scans around, you're getting tens of thousands of points of data. Do I need to store all of those points of data? Well, maybe if what I'm trying to do is to learn how to perceive the world with a laser scanner, but if I'm trying to understand traffic scenarios so I know what I need to program my vehicles to do, maybe not. Maybe I need a much more reduced set of data. All of this stuff is still emerging. The whole process of who needs to learn what data I can capture, what data I can and should share is really important. And the question is, how do I start to get that cheaply? So what was interesting is that when Google announced their automated vehicle project, they put a lot of cars out on the road and began to drive around and develop a lot of data. That gave them an initial advantage. But it soon became clear that if you're going to truly understand how to deploy automated vehicles in the US, having 20, 30, even 100 vehicles driving around is not going to get you there very quickly. Look at a company like Tesla, which has turned their entire fleet into data gathering devices, and think about how much more data can come in through that mechanism. There's now companies like Nauto and others looking at bringing in camera data and leveraging that. So as you think about that, what fleets may you have in your organization? What opportunities may you have of generating data about the sorts of things cars encounter, or the sorts of pedestrians who go through certain intersections, their velocities, the likelihood, the sort of things that I might need to make a prediction of how quickly I should be approaching this crosswalk. There are many, many data sources out there, and getting them cheaply, it will be a huge help in development. And the last thing I wanted to do with data is to kind of flip this around a little bit and ask, really, at the end of the day, is data the shovel or is data the gold? And so if you think about this really reduced cost of mobility, if I can get the cost of mobility down to 12, 13 cents a mile in a shared sense, how much do you pay for cost per click in terms of advertising? If you start to think about it, a short route within an urban environment is probably the same amount that may be paid on the internet per click. Could mobility be provided in return for the data, in return for the access, in return for potentially some sort of cultivated customer experience that you could provide while they're taking that ride? At the end of the day, we could think about this totally differently, where data, where the IT infrastructure, where all of these aspects of it, in fact, become the game for companies. And mobility is provided to people really as a consequence. A totally different way of thinking about transportation. So let me just leave it there with all of you with 3 questions to ask. So these are the sort of 3 framing questions that I think are important to think about. If you look at this really low-cost mobility, what is that going to do to you, to your businesses, to your customers? What sort of assumptions hinge on that? How might you be able to get involved? Think about how you might be able to get involved in some of these early pilots that would give you advance warning of which way some of these trends are going to go. And then think about your technologies and your businesses and where you may have the valuable picks and shovels that can make all of this go forward. So with that, I'd like to stop and either talk about these questions or any others that may be in your mind.
Thanks. So a couple questions, a couple areas you didn't really cover that have been kind of hotly debated these days. One is there's something like 1.3 to 1.7 million professional truck drivers in the U.S. Okay, what happens if 80% of them are out of work? So we're displacing large numbers of jobs without a real clear path that there's going to, we've always argued before technology disruption led to more jobs in different ways. It's unclear that these particular people are going to find their way to become autonomous vehicle programmers, right?
Yeah.
And then the separate topic you touched on briefly about the sort of ethics problem. Do I hit the van full of people or do I hit the pedestrian? Like, how do we resolve some of those issues as we look at autonomous vehicles driving in urban settings? Okay,
well, let me start with the first one. And I'm going to talk about truck drivers in particular, but I don't want this to seem dismissive because the point that you raised is an important one. And this is one that we talked about a lot when I was at the Department of Transportation as well. And in fact, the Department of Transportation and Department of Labor are discussing this very seriously, because when you look at the power of some of these artificial intelligence technologies and the rate at which you may start getting job dislocations as a result of it, it does seem like there could be some differences here than the technologies that have just traditionally opened up new jobs. And I think that is an important thing to take into account. While we open up mobility, while we open up opportunity for a lot of people with these technologies, we're also going to be closing some doors potentially. With respect to heavy truck drivers in particular, it's very interesting to look at the demographics there. I think the average age among private fleets of heavy truck drivers is about 54, average. And so what you see is it's actually a very big demographic bubble that has worked its way through. And so you see a lot of people right in their 50s to 60s who are truck drivers. So chances are those guys are going to have a job as long as they want one. What you see is that very few younger people are taking this up as a profession. It's a tough profession. And in fact, fleets are in some ways having to liquidate trucks because they can't find enough drivers. So with respect to trucking, I think the guys who are out there doing it now are often going to have a job as long as they want one into retirement. that doesn't mean that the job loss for the overall economy should be shrugged off. And I think when you look at transportation jobs often providing an important rung on the ladder, that's something that we need to think about at a very broad level. So I completely agree with that. With respect to ethics, yes, you hear a lot of these sort of problems posed in terms of, do I hit person A or do I hit person B? I think it's entirely the wrong framing. And I think people have gone down this sort of path of unsolvable philosophy problems and concluded that that is in fact the engineering challenge, is that engineers must now resolve problems that philosophers have been unable to resolve for thousands of years. I don't believe that's true. And so the thing is that we all drive, right? And so we are not actually solving these sorts of problems. What we are solving is really the sense of, what is my responsibility? And so as a driver, there's certain responsibility placed on you by society. We can think about, what is the responsibility we place on the automated vehicle? Will it be to avoid every accident? That's actually not feasible. But what I could say, for instance, is I want an automated vehicle which should not be involved in an accident with anybody else who's following the rules of the road. Starting point. Now, second, in the event that somebody's not following the rules of the road, we often compensate for each other as humans, and we should put a responsibility on the vehicle to compensate for that sort of behavior of somebody else who isn't following the rules of the road. And we probably want to do that up into the point where you start injuring the people in the vehicle. Now, if I just do those simple things where I say, don't hit people who are following the rules, compensate up to a point for people who aren't following the rules, have I perhaps created enough of a responsibility on an automated vehicle that it will be societally acceptable and legal? I'd argue potentially I have, and the real test in people's minds will going to be, do I get benefit from this? If it's merely something that helps wealthy individuals, I think people in general will be less tolerant of these collisions. But in fact, if you say, well, the vehicle was designed carefully, sometimes somebody runs out in the road and there's just not enough time. That's physics. And we can accept that because we see the huge benefits elsewhere.
So maybe a quick follow-up. The other challenge, it seems, is everybody's talking, and much of your talk was about fully automated vehicles. It seems like a much easier problem to solve would be, assisted driving. The lane change warnings, the assisted braking, and so on. It seems like much more achievable. It changes the economics, but it could also dramatically reduce the 35,000 deaths to much lower just by adding certain technologies to any vehicle without really changing the paradigm of how transportation works.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, that in fact you can do a lot for safety by adding some of these technologies, and you see a lot of the traditional OEMs doing it. The Peloton system, for instance, involves human drivers in both trucks, so it's not a fully automated system at all, and you can get a lot of benefits from that. One of the things that people argued for a while is you just add more and more of this, and then at some point you become a driverless vehicle, and I think it's become clear that that's not really a smooth path, and that there's sort of a set of technologies that you need to really drive the car and a set of technologies that you need to assist human drivers. And while they have some overlap, they're in fact distinct. So even most of the OEMs that you see that are going along this path of adding driver assistance systems are also looking at these other fully automated things, because that in fact is maybe the real economic gold mine for these companies.
Thanks so much.
Great, thanks a lot.